2024년 노벨 경제학상을 수상한 시카고 대학의 제임스 로빈슨 교수를 박원정 PD가 인터뷰했습니다. 그가 올해 경제의 화두로 무엇을 꼽았을까요?
뉴스매거진이 인터뷰한 제임스 A. 로빈슨 교수는 세계적으로 저명한 경제학자이자 정치학자입니다. 특히 정치와 경제발전 관계에 대한 연구로 잘 알려져 있습니다. 그는 지난달 7일 스웨덴 스톡홀름 왕립과학한림원에서 노벨 경제학상을 수상했습니다. 국가 간 부의 차이를 연구해 데런 에스모글루, 사이먼 존슨 교수와 함께 공동 수상했습니다. 그는 하버드 대학교에서 11년간 정치경제학을 가르쳤으며 2015년부터 시카고 대학의 해리스 공공정책학부에서 교수로 재직 중입니다. 로빈슨 교수는 트럼프 재집권이 경제에 어떤 영향을 끼칠 것인가 묻는 질문에 재앙이 될 것이라고 부정적으로 답했습니다.
I think it's probably going to be a disaster for the US economy, actually. I think the big picture here is, he won the election, and that represents, that's a signal of the fact that there's real problems in this country. There's real challenges, and the Democratic Party has not been able to deal with them. President Biden has not been able to deal with them. He doesn't really understand them, as far as I can see. He doesn't understand why people are so unhappy about immigration. He doesn't really understand the problems of working class people in this country. So that has given President Trump another 4 years, and he does understand, there are these problems, but the big concern for me is that his policies don't address the problems. People are worried about immigration, but immigration is not the problem. Immigration is not why jobs have disappeared in this country. It's not why social mobility has slowed down. It's not why wages of, the bottom 50% of the income distribution haven't changed for 50%. That's caused by other things. I think the China, the antagonism towards China and globalization, you could say, part of the problem is that, jobs have disappeared in this country as a consequence of of competition from China. That's true. There's a lot of evidence on that. So, but, this contraction of world trade, Americans have benefited enormously from world trade, from diversifying production, from making their telephones in China where it's much cheaper. Those phones are going to become more expensive. Controlling immigration is not going to solve any of the problems. So I don't see that President Trump really has a proper policy for dealing with any of these problems. He's going to cut taxes for rich people. It's going to create an enormous increase in the deficit. What has cutting taxes for rich people done, for economic growth? Nothing. It's just going to lead to further inequality. So I don't, there are big problems in this country, but I don't see he has any serious problems. He has any serious policies which can address the real problems, unfortunately.
이어 미국 사회 경제의 당면 과제에 대해선 이같이 말했습니다.
I think for the US, I think the key thing is, what can we do for working class people? What can we do? This is the country of opportunity historically. The United States had this dramatically high rates of social mobility that's fallen a lot in the last decades. How do we restore levels of social mobility in this country? How do we deal with this crisis of mental health and drug abuse and some of these social problems? How do we deal with these problems of stagnating wages for people without a college education? How do we kind of rebuild people's trust in institutions and trust in the future and the future of their children? I want to see real policies kind of which are thought through to deal with those issues, because they're big and they're important and they're massively affecting the trajectory of the society at the moment.
한편 로빈슨 교수는 2025년 세계 경제는 위축될 것이라고 내다봤습니다. 미국식 일방주의가 큰 영향을 끼칠 것이라는 것.
How do you forecast the global economy in 2025?
Well, I don't think that's so complicated to forecast. I think we're going to see a further contraction of world trade. That seems to be absolutely sure. Tariffs on China, President Biden didn't change President Trump's tariffs. They're going to get larger. They're talking about putting tariffs on everything. Suddenly it's occurred to the Republicans that they can actually use tariffs as a way of raising money for the government. In the first time in 150 years in this country, tariffs have seriously been thought of, taxes on trade have seriously been thought of as a way of raising fiscal resources. That seems to be going to happen. So you're going to see a big contraction of world trade. You know, that's going to ripple everywhere. That's going to be bad for commodity prices. It's going to be bad for economic growth in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, I think we have continued conflict in the Middle East and in Russia and Ukraine. And so I think, you know, the world economy is certainly going to contract and we're going to see world economic growth slow down. You know, what's going to happen in terms of the geopolitical tensions, you know, that is harder to predict. Whether, you know, President Trump is obviously going to try to convince Ukraine that they should surrender sovereignty over large parts of the country in exchange for a peace deal. Whether or not that's politically possible in Ukraine, that is very hard for me to understand.
시카고에서 뉴스매거진 박원정입니다.